Why are they taking it to the streets in Paris and London? This 21st century tale of two cities is not about revolution like in the Dickens classic, but about saving Europe's beloved welfare state. Let's start with France, where it was more than just Parisians that turned out Tuesday for round two of the biggest strike movement in years. At issue, much-needed pension reform for an aging population. Will the government bend on raising the retirement age to 64? Can it come up with compromises that don't force women and the underprivileged to work longer for their full pension? Over in the UK, it's civil servants calling for pay and working conditions to keep pace with double-digit inflation and reverse years of cuts in public services. A tipping point? We'll see. In both countries, COVID has impacted how we view job security, retirement, and our work-life balance. Burnout rates are higher. And while the French retire earlier and put in fewer hours than almost all their European counterparts at the office, well, they have just as much work. So how should the state factor productivity when it determines when its citizens have worked long enough to call it quits? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at strikes and the role of the state in these turbulent times. With us, Claire Lejeune, spokesperson for the left-wing LFI party, Unbowed France, as it's often
yes, that's the
translated.
Translation, yes.
Thank you for being with us.
That's fine.
Eric Chanet is economics advisor to the Montaigne Institute think tank. Welcome to the show.
Correct.
We welcome back Jeremy Stubbs, president of British Conservatives in Paris. Also, editor-in-chief of the magazine Causeur, and your cover story this month is, well, how do you translate that?
Everybody a retiree, the last French dream.
The last French dream. From Berkeley, California, Jonah Levy, associate professor of political science at the University of California, Berkeley. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for inviting me.
The France 24 debate, where you could join the conversation you have on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. While it's all happening out in the street on Tuesday, on the day after, officially nearly 1.3 million march, double that, say unions. Emmanuel Macron's government, well, trying to maintain a business-as-usual demeanor. Here you see images of the French Parliament's Social Affairs Commission reviewing the pension reform bill this Wednesday before it graduates from committee to the floor of the National Assembly. But can liberals and conservatives ignore polls that suggest more than two-thirds of the country opposes that legislation and those two new strike days that are scheduled for next week? Laurent Berstecker has the story.
From Rennes to Marseille to Paris, massive crowds poured into the streets of France for a fresh round of protests against a controversial pensions reform. Nearly 1.3 million people turned up nationwide, according to the government, twice as many according to unions, who called for more strikes in the coming weeks.
It shows a massive rejection of the retirement age at 64. This is one of the biggest protests that this country has seen in decades. The government must listen, otherwise we could be headed towards a democratic impasse.
Polls have shown the French are widely opposed to the reform, a flagship policy of Emmanuel Macron's second term in office. Opponents say the measure, and in particular plans to raise the retirement age from 62 to 64, will disproportionately affect the working class and further deepen inequalities. Despite the backlash, Macron has vowed to plow ahead with the reform, which he says is essential to offset public deficit. But the president's attitude has left many French people frustrated as the government continues to turn a deaf ear to their plight.
You are wearing people down. You are sapping all of our energy, and now there is nothing left in the tank. And when people have nothing left, that's when the anger becomes strongest.
While the government is refusing to lower the retirement age, it may be forced to make other concessions, as the bill is now set to be debated in Parliament. And with the Socialists, the Greens, and the NUPES coalition openly opposed to the project, Macron's centrist party is likely to need help from the conservative Republicans to push the reform through.
Yeah, second round is going to be two strike days next week. Let me begin with you, Claire Lejeune. Played musical chairs because we had lighting issues. So you're now sitting next to Jeremy Stubbs. You have this rarity in French politics, unanimity among the unions. And what's also interesting is you have a situation where nobody says they want the status quo. They all agree a reform is needed, just not this one.
Yes, exactly. So it's very rare that all the unions have been able to maintain this front. And that's linked with the fact that the CFDT has voted in their Congress this summer to say that it's non-negotiable to push the age for retiring.
This is the
further.
more moderate trade union confederation.
Exactly. It's the one who, on the previous reform, so in 2019, had actually supported or at least compromised with the government on the pensions issue. So basically, what's happening is that if the government doesn't listen to what's been going on in the streets, we're going to go towards a stalemate. And so all the debate now is to know if the government is going to be able to take into account what's being said, which is going to be hard because they have maintained the idea that they will not budge on the 64 age criteria. So
they say they already compromised by lowering it from 65 to 64.
Yes, but that's something that the unions and the people in France are not ready to accept. So there's very little criteria that they can now move on and compromise on. So it's going to be a question of struggle between the public opinion and the government now.
Public opinion, Éric Chanet, are you surprised to see that consistently it's numbers like 68%, 70% against this reform?
Well, I'm not fully surprised because this reform is another example of what some people have called a salami reform. France needs to implement a huge structural reform about the retirement system, which is basically bankrupt. But governments facing the opposition of the street, nobody wants to work longer. They do small reforms like, cutting the salami, but each one is painful. Even if you ask people to raise the retirement age from 62 to 63, they will say, this is unfair, I was not warned. So I'm not totally surprised. What is more important is the fact that the main unions, including the CFDT, which is the moderate union, has put this question of 64 as a linchpin. If you keep the 64, we will continue to demonstrate.
So why didn't the government just go with the numbers of years worked?
I will tell you why it is so important to raise the statutory retirement age. First, it has to be consistent with the number of years. As you said, the reform, which was decided a long time ago, but by a government which decided that, okay, we will lengthen the number of years you need to contribute to get the full reform, but not now. Later, when we will not be in the government. So this is now. So you have to be consistent. And the second issue is that everywhere the retirement age is raised year after year. A scientist, a demographer, mathematician and demographer I knew very well, James Voppel, who was at the Max Planck Institute in Germany. He's American, in Rostock. He's now in Denmark. He has published a paper in Science that was in 2002, showing that since 1840, I'm talking about the 19th century, until today, not exactly the life expectancy, but the longevity of the human species increases by 3 months per year. So there is nothing new here. So you just cannot, that doesn't make any sense, to keep the statutory retirement age where it is. You have to increase it more or less in line with the rise of life expectancy. Otherwise, how are you going to fund the system? So that's why, in my view, this symbolic number 64 is important.
It is important. Again, I'll put it to you, Jeremy Stubbs. Why not just make it about the number of years worked? I think 43 is the number bandied about. Why not say you work 43 years? So if you work 43 years from the age of 18, or you work 43 years from the age of 27?
Well, I think that because, as Eric's implying there, this cannot be the last reform. There are going to have to be many more reforms. Indeed, that's one of the problems and why there is opposition it's because every couple of years in France, people talk of another reform. So there's no sense that we're going towards a stable system. I mean, as I understand it, when the 65 age limit was introduced in 1945, the average life expectancy of a male worker was 68 years. So, you only had a couple of years of retirement. Now we've got a very, very long time. And of course, in France, you have this notion of the acquired rights. That is to say, once the workforce has acquired a right, you can't possibly go back on it, no matter what the pragmatic circumstances.
Is there room for compromise? Because even one of the government's own ministers admitted that women will be penalized, for instance, and have to work longer.
Well, unless the government has a small bone to throw, this really is a head-on clash. And I think we're at the moment where it's a strong arm contest between the two. Who will weaken first?
And looking at the numbers, who's losing that battle?
Well, the numbers are out there. That's good on the opposition side. On the other hand, this is a legislative matter, so it'll depend on what goes on in Parliament.
Jonah Levy, sitting where you are, what do you make of what's happening in France right now? Are you surprised?
I'm not surprised at all. Indeed, I wonder if the government was looking for this kind of conflict. It has no mandate for the reform. The reform is very regressive. There are other ways to balance the pension system, for example, by raising contributions of employees or employers or reducing benefits. But the government is putting everything on the age issue. And the age that's been chosen is extremely unfair because the only people who are retiring at age 62 are people with enough contributions, meaning they started working in their teens and have been working for 42, 43 years. Those are the people who will be hurt by this reform. By contrast, there's a second retirement age, 67, at which you can receive a full pension. And most people, particularly people who've attended university, retire at that age, and that's not being touched. So the reform is putting everything, all the savings, on the backs of the low-income manual laborers who've worked all their life, starting from a young age, and who have the lowest life expectancy to boot. So it's a very regressive reform, and the government seems almost to be going out of its way to seek a conflict.
Why are they doing that? Why are they seeking a conflict?
I think Macron, one, is very angry that his last pension reform went down to defeat. And his reform in 2019 was actually a quite progressive reform modeled on the Swedish point system that would have treated all retirees equally. What sank that reform was when the government at the last minute added an austerity measure to raise the de facto minimum retirement age from 62 to 64. That's what got the CFDT to turn against the reform and to join the protesters. That's what defeated the reform. Macron is angry, so now his reform, instead of being social progress, is just an austerity measure. And he's making sure to put the CFDT in its place by taking the one element that the CFDT hated, the red line from the last reform, and making it the core of this reform. There's something of a pissing contest, if I may be excused for the language.
All right. It's not a family show, I guess. During a Monday visit to the Netherlands, the French president insisted on the vital necessity of this reform. Let's take a listen.
First of all, I think that we must never forget, say that this reform is essential when we compare ourselves in Europe and when we look at the need that we collectively have to preserve and save our pay-as-you-go pension system.
Claire Lejeune, how do you answer that? Well, look at our neighbor's argument.
Well, to start with, the French Independent Advisory Board on Pensions actually said that the pension spending is not at all out of control. When you look at the scenarios they've produced, it actually points to a balancing of the pension system in decades to come. So it's just a blatant lie to say that there's an absolute rush to implement this plan. So and this is something they've been repeating, and it's not at all it doesn't match the expertise of this independent board.
But the leader of your party, Jean-Luc Mélenchon,
Yes.
he says he agrees that there is a need for reform, just not this reform.
Well, some kind of reform, but clearly not the most brutal reform you could imagine. As has been just said, the fact that you only use the parameter of age and you make it apply to everyone, whereas people have very unequal modes of working. Some manual labourers suffer immensely from the work they do on a daily basis, and they just can't go up to 64. There's actually a third of the poorest that will be dead before they are able to retire if we implement this measure. So it's an extremely brutal reform. It's brought about, it's pushed as if it was vital, whereas it's not at all if you look at the expertise. And there's a question that we are missing here is the question of what system do we want in a world where there's a climate crisis, where the meaning of work is also in a form of crisis. So it's all these very fundamental questions that must be in the debate, because the reason young people have also been taking to the streets is they don't see the meaning of our economic system anymore.
We'll talk about that point a little bit later on. Éric Chanet, do you agree there with Jonah Levy that for Emmanuel Macron, this is a personal power play with the moderate CFDT trade union?
I'm not a psychologist, so I don't know whether I should agree or disagree on that. One point I would agree with is that Macron was certainly disappointed that his big project of the first reform, which was inspired, as was said, by the Swedish, but also by the Italian system, which deserves to be mentioned, was killed by the opposition of some unions, but also by the COVID crisis. So it was impossible to implement this reform, but not only because of opposition and COVID, also because the transition between our current system, which is highly unfair for the future generations, and a system which would be fair was almost impossible. And those who have worked on that came to see Macron.
Yeah, because there's all these different, there's something like 40-odd pension plans in France.
Absolutely, and the independent workers have their system, the railways workers have their system. So putting everything in the same basket was a very nice idea on the paper, but practically the transition was almost impossible. So he had to drop the reform. Is he angry or not? I absolutely don't know. But I would add one point. Raising the retirement age was done it was 65, and it was cut to 60. Everybody applauded, of course, without thinking of the consequences.
That was 1981.
That was 81 when Mitterrand won the elections. And then it was raised from 60 to 62 with a strong opposition, blah, 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 blah. But the consequence was a steady rise of the employment rate of senior workers, which is a parameter on which France is very low compared to its peers.
So why don't they just lower payroll taxes for those who employ older workers? That way they'll be paying into the system instead of getting benefits because they're not productive.
No, that's not the point. The point is to increase the share of older workers at work. And it works by raising the retirement age. The signal is very important. It has worked. It would work again. By doing so, you raise the output of the country. You make more money.
But will employers hire those seniors?
But this is exactly what they have done. So we have this experiment, a natural experiment, as economists would say, from 60 to 62. The consequence was to raise the employment rate. With a higher employment rate, you have a higher output. You have higher revenues for the government. You have more money for the energy transition. You have more money for a lot of things. So that is why I think Macron appears stubborn. Maybe he will have to drop the reform, because we are in a country where demonstrations do matter, even though it's the job of the parliament. But that is important, this question of raising the output of the country.
All right, Claire Lejeune has a lot of time to sing the song When I'm 64 before she reaches that age. So we're talking about what's going to happen in the future for people of your generation. Over in the UK, it's the present they're worried about. Recently, it's been nurses and ambulance drivers. This Wednesday, British civil servants marching, including transit workers and teachers, whose union leaders point to what they say is inflation that's triggered a 15% drop in their real wages.
For the younger teachers, it's massive. I don't think they realise. But there's two of them working full-time, them and their partner. They're trying to afford a property, and maybe that's beyond them, so they're paying rent. I know that teachers are using food banks. That's not right.
Well, for more on this, let's cross now to our correspondent in London, Bénédicte Paviot. 500,000 people taking to the streets over in the UK. Is what's happening biggest march in years this Wednesday, or where you are, biggest march in years here where we are just 24 hours ago? Is it a similar vibe?
Well, it's similar in that money is involved. Where it's different is that the pension retirement age here is 65. So there is some surprise, I would say, amongst the population. I think it's 67 in Germany, possibly in Italy as well. So there is some surprise that there is such a strong feeling in France. But of course, it's for French voters to decide that the age should go from 62 to 64. But there is no doubt that for similar-sized populations, France and the United Kingdom have a similar, if we can call it, problem. They have an aging population. Now, they have very different health services. Here, the National Health Service, the NHS, which has been out on strike a lot, and which the nurses will be out on strike next week again. They started a few weeks ago. It's the first time in a century. There is a real crisis within that National Health Service because it's been very sorely tested during COVID. It's been very sorely tested basically recovering from COVID, and there are about 133,000 at last count understaffed. Lots of burnout of nurses, for example, male and female, leaving the profession, sometimes going because they're paid much more to go to agencies or going abroad. So today was very much about pay, and it was civil servants, over 100,000. In the streets, and certainly downing tools, and across whether it was airports or ports, longer queues, teachers in droves. We think about 30,000 demonstrators behind us. It all passed off peacefully, but the strength of feeling here amongst teachers, amongst university professors, bus drivers, train drivers, university lecturers, is really, there is a resolve there, and there is a real stalemate between Rishi Sunak's government, the Conservative government, 12 years of Conservative government that is really in trouble in the polls, certainly. Of course, 3 prime ministers just last year. This is exceptional stuff and historical stuff. But the Labour Party is doing very well in the polls. Now, we're not due an election till the end of 2024, 2025. But, to lose your party chairman, Nadim Zahawi, over tax problems, what the Labour Party really saying is you're mishandling the economy. What the government is saying, we cannot sanction pay rises that are matched to inflation at 10.5% because that would fuel inflation.
Bénédicte Paviot, many thanks for that live update from London. UK Conservatives doubling down. While they were marching outside, there was Prime Minister's question time. Conservatives sending to the House of Lords a bill that curtails the right to strike, while the opposition denounces the accusation on the part of the government that striking teachers are, quote, holding pupils hostage.
Is the Prime Minister going to get a grip and negotiate with working people, or does he intend being remembered as the PM who silenced and sacked hard-working nurses, paramedics, teachers, rail workers and firefighters in a cost-of-living crisis?
Mr. Speaker, when it comes to teachers, we've actually given teachers the highest pay rise in 30 years. It includes a 9% pay rise for newly qualified teachers and record investment in their training and development.
The gap in the language seems harsher in the UK than it does in France. We're kind of used to the opposite, Jeremy Stubbs. The French government's being very careful not to inflame its rhetoric. Here, pulling no punches, the Prime Minister.
Well, the fact is that the government has made a number of offers of pay rises to the different sectors, which in normal times would be considered quite generous. But the comeback from the unions is we've got inflation.
10.5%.
And even 16% on food, apparently. So we can see that people are pretty desperate. On the other hand, really, apart from pay rises, the real solution here is to cut inflation. That should be what the government is working on. I'm not actually sure that even if Labour were in power, they would find the money in the coffers to offer nurses 19% pay rises right now. The government is asking unions to go with the pay tribunals and follow those recommendations, which seems to be fairly reasonable. The trouble is that what is similar to what's happening in France is that once people have got the sort of the protest bit between their teeth, they're going to go as far as they can go.
Well, Jonah Levy, you described earlier the showdown between France's president and the unions. Is it the same story across the channel?
I think it's important to distinguish the two cases, and I think it goes to the nature of conservatism in the two countries, that the British government has continued to advocate for austerity and spending cuts, and after 12 years, it's starting to catch up with the government and with the quality of public services and protest, but Rishi Sunak is doubling down on this neoliberal strategy. On the other side of the channel, you have something of a schizophrenic conservatism. On the one hand, you have Macron, the neoliberal reformer, seeking confrontation with a very regressive pension reform. But there's another side of Macron and French conservatism, which is that of the statist protector. We saw this during COVID when Macron's slogan was whatever it costs to protect the French and French public services from the effects of the COVID crisis. And in response to rising inflation, we've seen a similar move of Macron, the statist protector. He sought to dampen the effects of inflation on the French public through a combination of various subsidies and checks written to low-income groups to offset higher inflation, and caps on energy prices that are keeping electricity, natural gas, and last year also gasoline far below market rates. And this is Macron, the statist protector, limiting the effects of inflation on the French public through expensive government spending measures. And that's part of the reason why inflation has been a little lower in France than in the UK. And it's also part of the reason why the mobilization we see today is less centered on the cost of living, even though that's clearly an issue in France, and more on Macron, the neoliberal reformer, with his pension reform.
Yeah, Eric Chanet, this anxiety over the state that protects and that we in France cherish, is that anxiety justified?
Well, that's part of the French paradox. People hate the state, but they are expecting the state to protect them. But we are used to live with that. I would add...
Is the anxiety justified, though?
The anxiety about the government not being able to protect people is perfectly justified, because the government cannot do everything. Climate change, aging population, risk of pandemic, well, the government will not protect people against that. So this part of the anxiety is understandable. Now, regarding protecting people more than it is done in other countries, yes, this is possible. And I would add one thing on the measures taken by the government to limit inflation. There was an economic point. It was not only about protecting people. It was to prevent the wage price loop leading to ever higher inflation. by capping energy prices. By the way, they have increased 15% today for electricity, because you cannot cap forever. But by doing that, limiting inflation has limited wage increases and thus has prevented the wage price loop to start in France, which is a good achievement. So that was an economic argument.
Claire Lejeune, you agree if it could have been worse if we'd followed the same path as the UK?
I actually don't agree that there's the French hate and love the state at the same time. I think the question is a question of democracy, and all the crises that have been mentioned, the climate crisis, the pandemic, even the economic crisis that we have, and the inflation, they're all created by a system that's political. And if the state, which is the form of social control that we can have over the economic system, over natural resources, if we can't make decisions together to make this system work for everyone, then I don't know what the state is. I mean, I don't think it's as simple as saying we love or hate the state. We're all part of it. And that's why there's I think French people are very fond of the social system that we've created. In the UK, you've also got a higher rate of private pension systems, private pension schemes, and that's what we don't want. I think we're very fond of a system where national solidarity between generations is very important. So I think, and also I don't think that Macron had such a protective aspect to his policies even during the pandemic. Yes, there was a quoi qu'il en coûte, but that translated
whatever it costs,
whatever it costs policy, but that translated into 157 billion poured into the economy, poured into companies, without any control on are they changing their ways of producing to face the climate crisis? Are they balancing the pay sheets to make our society more
So you're saying he wrote
fair?
blank checks to the wrong people?
Exactly. He protected the economy, and the economy as it's functioning right now, which is not a fair way, and which is in a way that's going to lead us to a major climate crisis in decades to come.
We talked about raising the retirement age and why it is or is not necessary to put it at 64. There's also the question of what's happened beforehand. We touched on it when we talked about certain jobs that are harder to do. There's also the question when a retiring employee gets that going away party or that golden watch, it's a time to reflect not only on how long he or she has worked, but how hard. And it varies according to profession and also according to what nation you're in. Despite its 35-hour work week, the French are almost as productive as the Germans, and as you can see, more productive, Jeremy Stubbs, than the British. Does that surprise you? These are OECD statistics.
No, but actually before the program began, Eric explained this to me extremely well, which is that in Britain, you've got a lot more low-skilled people who are actually working, which brings the average of productivity down. So we can't really, I think I'm right here, Eric, we can't really compare, we're not comparing like with like. We're not comparing the same level of unemployment, for example. Although the question of people's appreciation of work
but you work here in France. I know it's anecdotal, but still, the French work just as hard as everybody else in Europe. They just do it in fewer hours, so that's more pressure.
Well, they have a very different sort of imaginary relationship with work, because the holidays and retirement are sort of precious beacons in the night for French people. I mean, in Britain, the retirement age is being extended at the moment, probably until 67 by 2028. It's not yet completely decided there. And this is not what's drawing the protests. As we know, as you know very well, in the United States, people get, 2 weeks of holiday a year often. People have a different relationship to work. I'm not saying one is better than the other, but if you touch retirement and holidays in France, if you touch those, politically, you're in for trouble.
Many young people in Tuesday's demonstrations. How long will they work? How hard will they work? There's been a radical shift in thinking within the last 20 years in this country. That's according to a study conducted by the Fondation Jaurès, a think tank, in a survey commissioned on attitudes to work. And here you see on this graph how in 2008, 62% of the people wanted their career to come first, and now it's almost inversely proportionate the other way. They want more. More free time, and they feel as though they're having less money. Jonah Levy, when you're in Berkeley, California, I guess you can see Silicon Valley from your window. There is this feeling that the digital age has changed attitudes to work.
I think it's important to take those numbers with a very large grain of salt, particularly in the wake of the COVID crisis, where supposedly a lot of attitudes toward work are changing, but it's hard to separate short-term and long-term effects. And I really want to push back against the notion that the French aren't serious about work. They don't care about work. They're lazy. The British are raising their retirement age to 67. Well, the French age, in fact, is 67 for the vast majority of the population, because you only get a full pension at 67 if you've contributed for 42, 43 years. So for most French citizens, the retirement age is already 67. And finally, I think that a lot of the anguish relates to how French governments are pursuing reform, leaving aside, that they don't negotiate or discuss with anyone, and so leave the reform in the dark until the last minute, leave the public in the dark. But in terms of the substance, as opposed to a salami slice approach, I would call it a perverse Goldilocks approach. That is, these reforms are regressive and painful enough to antagonize the French public and provoke protests, but they're insufficiently ambitious to actually solve the problem that they were designed to solve. And even the French government's projections are that the system will be in deficit with the reform in 2030 unless the unemployment rate is below 4.5%. The last time that happened was in the 1970s, before Emmanuel Macron was even born. So I think this dynamic of one painful regressive measure after another, with none of them actually solving the problem, has soured much of the French public on these kinds of yet another pension reform, yet another labor market liberalization, yet another reorganization of the healthcare system, and the sense that economic liberalization is hitting the disadvantaged again and again. And it's not even solving the problems. You're not even getting the Thatcher economic miracle that supposedly happened in the UK. No one is pointing to France as an economic model in the wake of the various reforms.
It's more long-term there. You heard Jonah Levy say at Éric Chanet. But you have had, in recent years, this digital acceleration and the COVID pandemic. And we see the EU's statistics outfit, Eurostat, says the number of burnouts are higher as a result. People are having more pressure in the workplace than before.
That's right. That's right. Is it linked to working less hours? Absolutely not. Institut Montaigne will publish tomorrow an in-depth study based on a very large-scale survey of the relationship between the French people and work. And I was surprised by one of the results, which is that the people who say that they are overworked, call that burnout or not, it's practically the same thing. The proportion is the same whether people work 30 hours or 47 hours. It is not correlated at all to the number of hours. On the other hand, it is highly correlated to the share of hours worked at home in teleworking. So, and this is something new, which, as you said, strongly increased during the COVID crisis. So it happens. So it seems that working from home is to some extent correlated to the rise of this partially subjective, partially totally objective feeling of burnout. So we have really to work much harder on that. May I just make a point? Those who are striking in France, 80% of them retire before 60. So the French railways, the metro in Paris, electricity and gas production. They
partly
are the
because
only one
yeah,
on
but it's
strike.
partly because it's been weekday strikes.
No.
Private sector workers have not come
private
out.
sector workers never went on strike on pensions. It was only these sectors who are retiring, let me repeat that, much before 60, and I'm talking about the average retirement age. Last thing, the average retirement age is 63.4. It's not 67. 63.4, because some people are retiring at 55. Some people are retiring at 68. On average, 63.4.
Claire Lejeune, there are 2 demonstrations next week, including for the first time since this movement began, a demonstration on a Saturday, February the 11th. Are you expecting more people than we saw Tuesday?
Well, there's 2/3 of French people who are against this plan to reform.
68.
So I don't think it's
Even more than
only.
2/3.
I don't think it's only the railroad workers or.
But they are not on strike. That's the point.
It's yes, but they're in the streets. I mean, on Tuesday the demonstration was gathered an incredible diversity of people, of ages. So I really think that it was quite representative of those 2/3 of people. And indeed, so now there's enough momentum to organise these demonstrations, both on the 7th, so next Tuesday, and on the Saturday. There was actually already a march demonstration on the Saturday after the 19th, and that was organised by the youth organisations.
Right.
Then, but yeah.
So you're expecting more people next Saturday?
So yeah, I think now it's quite clear that we can obtain a victory on and make the government back down and abandon this idea, because something that the government hasn't maybe measured is that Emmanuel Macron was re-elected, but not by a landslide. He was re-elected by the skin of his teeth, because people turned out to block the extreme right from getting into government.
And how do you feel personally, because we've had in this conversation the fact that there isn't this culture of compromise, like you have, say, in Germany. Would you like to see a compromise?
Well, I mean, the absence of compromise in this situation is clearly because of the government. They went forwards with something they knew would be that there'd be a united front on the union's part, and that it would be highly unpopular, especially in times where people are already having to face inflation, and we're coming out from a pandemic, there's wars back in Europe. I mean, it's the worst situation to bring about a reform that's this brutal. So the absence of compromise here is because of the government, and because they're pushing on the issue of age, which is the least fair of the parameters we can move if we want to reform the pension system.
Jeremy Stubbs, if Emmanuel Macron does blink, will it be some kind of a watershed moment, or is that just par for the course?
I think it will be a watershed moment, because he is already, as we know, in a difficult position, not having a clear majority, and there is a lot of his credibility, and indeed his reputation with posterity, which I think, if I were to do a little bit of psychology, not too much, but a little bit, I think he cares a lot about that. And he does not want to lose this fight. I think he's going to go as far as he can.
We're out of time, Jonah Levy. What's your prediction?
I only predict the past, never the future.
All right. I want to thank you so much for joining us from Berkeley, California. A wise man there. Claire Lejeune, I want to thank you as well. Jeremy Stubbs, Éric Chanet, thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.